The rain came down hard that October evening, turning the streets into rivers of orange light from the street lamps above. Margaret Chen stood outside the Steinhardt Music Hall. Watching well-dressed people hurry inside with their expensive umbrellas and designer coats, she clutched her old leather music folder against her chest, just trying to keep it dry under her small drugstore umbrella that had seen better days. At 52 years old, Margaret had learned to be invisible. She wore her usual navy cardigan, the one with the pills forming on the sleeves from too many washes. Her sensible black shoes squeaked slightly on the marble floor as she finally stepped inside, leaving wet footprints behind her. The grand lobby smelled like perfume and money, and Margaret suddenly felt like she'd walked into the wrong building. Around her, young pianists stood in clusters, their backs straight, their evening gowns and tuxedos making them look like they belonged in a magazine. They spoke about conservatories and summer programs in Europe, about their teachers who had studied under famous composers. Margaret kept her head down and walked toward the registration desk. The woman behind the desk wore glasses on a gold chain and had the kind of haircut that probably costs more than Margaret's monthly grocery budget. She was typing something on her computer, her long red nails clicking against the keys. "Excuse me," Margaret said softly. "I'm here to register for the recital." The woman looked up briefly, her eyes scanning Margaret from head to toe in less than a second. "The waiting area for parents is down that hall to the left. Performers check in here." "Yes, I know. I'm a performer. Number 23. The woman's perfectly shaped eyebrows rose slightly. She looked down at her list, running her finger down the page. "Margaret Chen. That's me." "Oh." The woman's surprise was barely hidden. She printed out a small name tag and handed it across the desk. "You'll be called in order. Maestro Rousseau is judging tonight, so please be ready when your number is announced. He doesn't like to wait." Margaret took the name tag with both hands, like it might fly away if she wasn't careful. "Thank you." She found a seat in the back row of the waiting area, away from the groups of confident young musicians. Her folder looked shabby next to their pristine leather portfolios with gold initials stamped on the corners. Inside her folder were photocopied pages from library books, some with coffee stains and pencil marks in the margins where she'd written notes to herself. During late-night practice sessions, the room buzzed with nervous energy. A tall boy, maybe 19 or 20, sat down in the empty seat beside her. He wore a perfectly fitted black suit and kept checking his phone, his leg bouncing with anxiety. "First time here?" he asked without really looking at her. "Yes," Margaret replied. "Yeah, this recital is pretty competitive. I've been training for it all year with Professor Westfield at the conservatory. You probably haven't heard of him, but he's kind of a big deal." The boy finally glanced at her. "Are you waiting for your daughter or son?" Margaret felt the familiar sting of being overlooked, but she'd grown used to it over the years. "Actually, I'm here to perform." The boy's expression changed from friendly to confused, then to something that looked almost like amusement. "Oh, really? That's cool. Good for you." He said it the way people talk to children who say they want to be astronauts. Then he turned away and started scrolling through his phone. Clearly done with the conversation, Margaret opened her folder and looked down at the music. Chopin's Nocturne in C-sharp minor. She'd been practicing it for 8 months, ever since she'd found that old piano in the attic. Her fingers moved slightly, pressing invisible keys on her lap. Running through the difficult passages she'd stayed up until midnight working on just last night, around her. The other performers warmed up in their heads or whispered encouragements to each other. A group of 3 young women in the corner kept looking at Margaret and whispering. One of them giggled, quickly covering her mouth with her hand. Margaret knew what they were thinking. What was this middle-aged woman in her cardigan doing here, among serious musicians? The truth was, Margaret had been asking herself the same question for weeks. When she'd seen the flyer for the community recital at the library, something inside her had stirred. It had been 40 years since she'd last performed in front of anyone. 40 years since she'd had to give up her dreams of music school, of concert halls, of a life lived through piano keys instead of filing cabinets and dinner plates. But that piano in the attic had called to her. Tom, her late husband, must have bought it years ago at some estate sale. He'd always promised he'd get her a piano one day, when they had the money, when the kids were grown, when life slowed down. But life never slowed down, and then Tom was gone. And Margaret was alone in a two-qua house with nothing but memories and regrets, learning to play again. At 50 had been humbling. Her fingers didn't move the way they used to. The arthritis in her left hand made some stretches painful. She couldn't practice during the day because she was afraid the neighbors would hear her stakes through the thin walls of her duplex. So she played at night, when the world was asleep, when no one could judge her for trying to grasp something that had slipped through her fingers decades ago. Number 17, please prepare. Number 18, you're on deck. The announcement jolted Margaret back to the present. She was number 23. 6 more performers before her turn. Her heart started beating faster. Through the closed doors of the concert hall, she could hear muffled piano music. Someone was playing something fast and technical, all the notes hitting perfectly, like raindrops on a metal roof. When they finished, there was polite applause, then silence. Then another performer began. Margaret's hands started to sweat. She wiped them on her slacks, hoping the moisture wouldn't make her fingers slip on the keys. She tried to remember what her childhood piano teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, used to tell her before recitals. Breathe, Margaret. The piano is your friend. Just tell it what your heart wants to say. But that was a lifetime ago, when Margaret's heart had been light and full of possibilities. What would her heart say now? What could a woman who'd spent 40 years making other people's meals, typing other people's words, and living other people's dreams possibly have to share? Number 21, you're up. Number 22. Please be ready. 2 more before her. Margaret stood up, her legs feeling unsteady. She walked toward the door that led backstage, her worn folder pressed against her chest like armor. The boy in the expensive suit glanced up at her as she passed, then returned to his phone. The 3 young women in the corner had moved on to talking about some party after the recital. Nobody watched Margaret Chen walk toward her moment. Nobody expected anything from the modest woman in the cardigan. And perhaps that was exactly how it needed to be, because what was about to happen in that concert hall wasn't about them or their expectations. It was about a woman who'd been silent for 40 years, finally finding her voice again. It was about every dream that had been postponed, every talent that had been buried, every person who'd been told they were too old, too late, too ordinary to matter. Margaret stood in the wings now, watching number 22 take the stage. Through the gap in the curtain, she could see him, Maestro Victor Rousseau, the legendary pianist whose approval could change everything. He sat in the front row, his silver hair perfectly styled, his expression neutral but slightly bored after hours of performances. In just a few minutes, Margaret would sit at that piano, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. Margaret sat in the dim backstage area, listening to number 22 finish his performance. The applause filtered through the heavy curtains, polite but not overwhelming. She closed her eyes and let her mind drift backward, the way it often did these days when things got quiet. She was 12 again, sitting at the old upright piano in her elementary school's music room. Mrs. Rodriguez. Her teacher stood beside her with one hand on Margaret's shoulder. "You have something special, child," she'd said that day. "Something I don't see very often. You don't just play the notes. You feel them." Margaret remembered how those words had made her heart soar. For weeks afterward, she'd practiced every day after school, her small fingers stretching to reach octaves that seemed impossibly far apart. Mrs. Rodriguez had even written a letter to Margaret's parents, explaining that their daughter had real talent, the kind that deserved proper training at a music academy in the city. Her father had read that letter at the kitchen table, his coal-stained hands holding the paper carefully like it might tear. Her mother had stood by the stove, stirring a pot of beans, not saying anything. They were good people, hard-working people, but money was always tight in their small mining town in West Virginia. "Well, think about it," her father had finally said, folding the letter and putting it in his shirt pocket. "Music school is expensive, but maybe we can figure something out." Margaret had gone to bed that night dreaming of concert halls and beautiful gowns, of playing piano in front of hundreds of people who would close their eyes and listen to every note. But 3 weeks later, everything changed. The mind collapse happened on a Tuesday morning. Margaret was in math class when the principal came to get her. She remembered the walk down the empty hallway, the sound of her shoes on the linoleum floor, the way the principal's hand felt heavy on her shoulder, but his grip was gentle, like he was afraid she might break. Her father survived, but his back didn't. 3 crushed vertebrae meant he'd never work in the mines again. Never work anywhere that required lifting or bending or standing for long hours. The workers' compensation barely covered the medical bills. And suddenly, the Chen family was drowning in debt they couldn't see the bottom of. Margaret's piano lessons stopped first. Then her mother started taking in laundry from the wealthier families in town. Margaret got a job at Rosie's diner, washing dishes after school and on weekends. Her hands, which had been learning to create beautiful music, now spent their time scrubbing, dried gravy off plates and hauling heavy bags of garbage to the dumpster out back. She was 15 when she played piano for the last time. The school was having a small concert, and Mrs. Rodriguez had begged her to perform just one piece. Margaret had agreed, even though she hadn't practiced in months. Her fingers stumbled through Mozart's Piano Sonata, No. 16, hitting wrong notes and losing tempo. In the audience, she could see the disappointment on Mrs. Rodriguez's face. And something inside Margaret cracked. After that, she avoided the music room entirely. It hurt too much to walk past that piano and know what she'd lost. Number 23, you're next. Please be ready. The announcement pulled Margaret back to the present. She opened her eyes and looked down at her hands. They were older now, the skin loose and spotted, the veins visible beneath the surface. These weren't the hands of a concert pianist. These were the hands of someone who'd lived a completely different life. She thought about Tom, her husband of 28 years. They'd met when she was 22, working as a cashier at the grocery store. He'd come through her line every Wednesday to buy the same things: bread, milk, lunch, meat, and a small bouquet of flowers that he said were for his mother. One Wednesday, he'd asked if maybe the flowers could be for Margaret instead. Would she like to have dinner with him on Friday? Tom had been kind and steady, exactly what Margaret needed after years of struggle. He worked for the postal service, walking the same route every day, rain or shine. They got married in a small ceremony at the courthouse, with just their parents and a few friends watching. No fancy wedding, no honeymoon to exotic places, just 2 people promising to take care of each other. The babies came quickly after that. 3 children in 5 years, 2 boys and a girl. Margaret had loved being a mother, but she'd also loved the person she used to be. The girl who dreamed of music school and concert halls. Sometimes she'd sing to her children at bedtime, made up lullabies that she'd compose on the spot. And she'd wonder what might have been if life had gone differently. She'd gotten a job as a medical transcriptionist when the youngest started school. For 20 years, she'd sat at a computer, typing up doctor's notes and patient files, her fingers flying across the keyboard instead of piano keys. It paid the bills. It put food on the table. It helped send her kids to college, but it wasn't music. Tom had known somehow how much she missed it. He never said anything directly, but Margaret would catch him watching her sometimes when a classical piece came on the radio. The way her fingers would move slightly, following along with the melody, the faraway look in her eyes. On their 25th anniversary, Tom had taken her to a piano concert downtown. They'd sat in the balcony, in the cheapest seats, and watched a young pianist perform Chopin. Margaret had cried during the nocturne, tears running down her face in the darkness, and Tom had held her hand without asking why. 2 years ago, on an ordinary Thursday morning, Tom had a heart attack while walking his postal route. The doctor said it was quick, that he probably didn't suffer. Margaret didn't know if that made it better or worse. One moment he was there, solid and dependable as always, and the next moment he was gone, leaving her alone in their small house with 40 years of memories and an aching emptiness she didn't know how to fill. The funeral was well attended. Tom had known everyone in the neighborhood after decades of delivering their mail. People told stories about him, about his kindness, his terrible jokes, his reliability. Margaret had stood there in her black dress, nodding and thanking people, feeling like she was watching everything from very far away in the months after. She'd avoided going through Tom's things. It hurt too much. But eventually, she'd forced herself to clean out the attic, boxing up old clothes and books, trying to decide what to keep and what to donate. That's when she'd found it. The piano was hidden under old blankets and Christmas decorations, pushed into the corner where the roof sloped down. An old upright, probably from the 1960s, with worn keys and scratches on the wood. Margaret had stood there staring at it for a long time, not understanding how it had gotten there. Then she'd found the receipt tucked inside the piano bench. Tom had bought it 7 years ago at an estate sale. 7 years, and he'd never mentioned it, never brought it downstairs, never asked her to play. Maybe he'd been waiting for the right moment. Maybe he'd been planning to surprise her on some future anniversary. Maybe he'd known that she needed to come to it on her own terms. In her own time, Margaret had cried that day in the attic, her hands on the dusty keys, thinking about all the things they'd never gotten to do, all the dreams they'd postponed until someday. But then she'd pressed down on middle C, and the note had rung out clear and true, filling the quiet attic with sound, and she'd started to play. Number 23. Margaret Chen, you're on. Margaret stood up, her folder clutched tight. The stage manager held the curtain open, gesturing for her to go through. Beyond it, she could see the lights, the piano, the audience waiting. 40 years had passed since she'd last performed. 40 years of other people's dreams, other people's needs, other people's lives. But tonight, just for these few minutes, the music would be hers again. The walk from backstage to the piano felt like miles. Margaret's shoes made soft sounds on the polished wood floor, and she was suddenly aware of every eye in the room turning toward her. The concert hall was bigger than she'd imagined from backstage, with rows of red velvet seats rising up toward the back. In a massive crystal chandelier hanging from the ceiling like frozen stars, she could hear whispers rippling through the audience. "The program," said Margaret Chen. Number 23 inches, but it didn't say anything about her age or her background, and she could feel their confusion. After hours of watching young, polished performers in their formal wear, here came this ordinary-looking woman in a cardigan, carrying a folder that looked like it had been through a washing machine, the Steinway Grand. Piano sat center stage under a spotlight, its black surface so shiny she could almost see her reflection in it. Margaret had never played on anything this nice. The piano in her attic had sticky keys and needed tuning. She'd practiced on that imperfect instrument for 8 months. Now she was supposed to perform on something that probably cost more than her car. She set her folder on the music stand with shaking hands. The pages fluttered slightly from the air conditioning vent above. She adjusted the bench, moving it forward an inch, then back half an inch, then forward again. Her hands were trembling so badly she had to clasp them together to make it stop. In the front row, Maestro Victor Rousseau sat with perfect posture, his silver hair swept back from his face. He wore an expensive suit and a look of patient boredom, the expression of someone who'd sat through too many amateur performances today. Next to him sat 2 other judges, both looking equally tired. One was checking his watch. Margaret took a breath and looked out at the audience. Somewhere in those seats were the young pianists who'd ignored her in the waiting room, the registration woman who'd assumed she was somebody's mother, all those people who'd looked right through her like she was invisible. For a moment, doubt crashed over her like a wave. What was she doing here? She was 52 years old, with arthritic hands, 40 years of rust on skills she'd barely developed in the first place. These judges had probably heard hundreds of properly trained musicians. What could she possibly offer them? She thought about walking off the stage, making some excuse, apologizing for wasting everyone's time. But then she remembered Tom finding that piano at the estate sale, spending money they didn't have much of, loading it into a borrowed truck, somehow getting it up into their attic without her knowing, keeping it secret for 7 years because he believed, even when she'd stopped believing in herself, that one day she'd play again. Margaret placed her hands on the keys. They felt cool and smooth under her fingertips. She closed her eyes and she began to play. The opening notes of Chopin's Nocturne in C-sharp minor floated into the air, hot, soft and delicate. Her right hand carried the melody, while her left hand provided the gentle accompaniment. And for the first few measures, it was technically correct, competent, nothing special, But then something shifted. Margaret stopped thinking about the judges or the audience or her arthritic fingers or the fact that she'd learned this piece from a photocopied library book. She stopped thinking at all. Instead, she let herself feel. She felt the weight of being 12 years old and losing her dreams in a single moment. The melody carried that loss, each note aching with it. She felt the exhaustion of working at the diner, washing dishes until her hands were raw, watching other kids her age do normal teenage things while she counted tips in her apron pocket. The music grew stronger as her left hand moved into the more complex passages. She felt the quiet joy of meeting Tom, his steady kindness, the way he'd loved her without needing her to be anything other than herself. She felt the overwhelming love she'd had for her babies, staying up all night with them when they were sick, singing made-up songs. Because she couldn't afford music lessons for them either, her fingers stumbled slightly on a difficult run, a place where her self-taught technique showed its limits. But she didn't stop. She pushed through it, letting the imperfection become part of the story. Because life was full of imperfections, wasn't it? Full of stumbles and mistakes and moments when your fingers couldn't quite reach what your heart was trying to say. In the audience, something was changing. The whispers had stopped. Programs were no longer rustling. Even the judge who'd been checking his watch had lowered his arm, his attention pulled to the stage. Margaret played through the middle section where the melody turned darker, more urgent. This was where she felt all the years of longing. All the moments she'd heard music on the radio and had to pull her car over because the beauty of it hurt too much. All the times she'd walked past music stores and looked at the pianos in the windows, knowing they weren't for people like her. She felt Tom's death in these notes too. The horrible emptiness of coming home to a house that was too quiet. The way she'd sit at the kitchen table and listen to the clock tick, not wondering what she was supposed to do with all the years she had left. Tears started running down her face, but she didn't stop playing. Her vision blurred, but her fingers knew where to go. They'd played these passages hundreds of times in her attic. Late at night, when the world was asleep and she could finally be honest about everything she'd lost and everything she'd never had. But the nocturne doesn't end in darkness. Chopin brings it back to light, and Margaret felt that too. She felt the morning she'd found the piano in the attic, that moment of understanding that Tom had left her one final gift. She felt the first time she'd played a complete piece after 40 years, how her heart had felt like it might burst. She felt every small victory of the past 8 months, mastering a difficult passage, playing something beautiful enough that she'd had to stop and catch her breath. The final section rose and fell like breathing, like waves on a shore, and Margaret played it with everything she had. This wasn't about perfect technique or conservatory training. This was about a life lived, about pain and joy and loss and hope, all mixed together. About finding your voice. Even when the world has told you for 40 years that you don't have one. Maestro Rousseau sat frozen in his seat. His expression completely changed. His eyes were wide, glistening with moisture. The board mask had fallen away, replaced by something raw and real. His mouth was slightly open, like he'd been about to say something, and forgotten how to speak. The woman next to him had her hand pressed to her chest. Several people in the audience were crying openly. Margaret played the final phrases, letting them fade away slowly, like watching the sun set. The last note hung in the air, sweet and clear and final. Then silence complete. Absolute silence. Margaret opened her eyes, suddenly aware that she was crying, that her face was wet with tears, that her hands were shaking again, but for a different reason now. She looked down at the keys, at her ordinary hands that had somehow just said everything she'd never been able to put into words. The silence stretched on. And for a terrible moment, Margaret thought she'd done something wrong, that everyone was shocked at how badly she'd played. Then Maestro Rousseau stood up, and the entire concert hall exploded into applause. The applause washed over Margaret like a physical force. She sat frozen at the piano bench, her hands still hovering over the keys, not quite believing what was happening. People were on their feet now, clapping so hard it echoed off the walls of the concert hall. Some were wiping their eyes. Others were smiling at her with the kind of warmth usually reserved for old friends. Margaret stood up awkwardly, unsure of what to do with her body. Should she bow, wave? She'd never gotten this far in her imagination when she'd practiced. She'd always assumed she'd play, people would clap politely, and she'd leave the same way she came in, invisible and unremarkable. She grabbed her folder, ready to hurry off the stage before anyone could see how much she was shaking, but then a voice cut through the applause. Wait, the word was spoken with authority, with a thick French accent that made it sound like a command from another era. The applause died down as people turned to see who had spoken. Maestro. Victor Rousseau was walking toward the stage. Margaret's heart lurched. Was she in trouble? Had she broken some rule she didn't know about? The maestro climbed the stage steps with surprising quickness for a man who had to be in his 70s. And suddenly he was standing right in front of her. Up close, she could see that his eyes were red. This legendary pianist, who had performed in the greatest concert halls of Europe and Asia, who had played for presidents and royalty, was looking at her with tears barely held back. "Please," he said, his voice gentle now. "Please, don't go yet." Margaret clutched her folder tighter. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." "To what?" He interrupted her, and a small smile appeared on his face. "To make an old fool like me cry. To remind me why I fell in love with music in the first place?" She didn't know what to say to that. The audience had gone completely quiet now, everyone leaning forward to hear what was happening on stage. Maestro Rousseau turned to face them, though he kept one hand gently on Margaret's arm, as if afraid she might vanish if he let go. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his accent making each word sound important, "I have been judging piano recitals for more than 30 years. I have heard thousands of performances. I have listened to students from the finest conservatories in the world, young people with perfect technique and flawless execution." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "But I have not heard anything like what this woman just played. Not in a very long time." Margaret felt her face burning. This couldn't be real. Any moment now she'd wake up in her attic, having fallen asleep at her old piano again. The maestro turned back to her. "Tell me, Mrs. Chen, where did you study? Who was your teacher?" Margaret's voice came out as barely a whisper. She cleared her throat and tried again. "I had lessons when I was a child. Mrs. Rodriguez, at Lincoln Elementary School. But that was 40 years ago. I haven't had formal training since then." A murmur went through the audience. The maestro's eyebrows rose. 40 years. "And you have been playing all this time?" "No." Margaret shook her head. "I stopped when I was 12. My family needed money, and lessons were expensive. I just started again 8 months ago." "8 months," Maestro Rousseau repeated, as if testing whether the words made sense. "You learned Chopin's Nocturne in 8 months, with no teacher, after a 40-year absence from music?" When he put it that way, it did sound impossible. Margaret nodded anyway. "How?" he asked simply. "I found a piano in my attic. My husband had bought it years ago, but he died before." She stopped, her voice catching. "I taught myself from library books. I practiced at night so the neighbors wouldn't hear my mistakes." The maestro was quiet for a long moment, just looking at her. Then he turned back to the audience. "Do you understand what you have just witnessed?" His voice rang out across the hall. "This is not about technique. Technique can be taught to anyone with patience and discipline. This is about truth. This is about music that comes from a life fully lived, from a heart that has known real joy and real sorrow." He gestured to the seats where the other performers sat. "I mean no disrespect to the other talented musicians here tonight. Many of you have skills that Mrs. Chen may never develop. You can play faster, cleaner, more accurately. You know things about theory and composition that she might not understand." The young man who'd sat next to Margaret in the waiting room was staring up at the stage, his face pale. "But," the maestro continued, his voice growing stronger, "what Mrs. Chen has cannot be taught in any conservatory. It cannot be bought with expensive lessons or prestigious summer programs. She plays with something that is becoming rare in our modern world of perfection and polish. She plays with soul." Margaret felt like her legs might give out. This couldn't be happening. People like her didn't get praised by legends. People like her played in their attics and hoped nobody complained about the noise. Maestro Rousseau reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card. He held it out to her with both hands, like it was something precious. Mrs. Chen, I stopped taking private students 5 years ago. I told myself I was too old, too tired, that I had nothing left to teach. But I would be honored, truly honored, if you would allow me to work with you. Margaret stared at the card like it might bite her. I don't understand. You want to teach me? Yes, he said simply. If you will have me as your teacher, I think we could learn much from each other. She took the card with trembling fingers. It was heavy, expensive paper with gold lettering. Victor Rousseau, concert pianist and professor of music. There was a phone number and an email address. I can't afford, she started to say. He held up his hand. I do not want your money, Mrs. Chen. I want to be part of your musical journey. It would be my privilege. The audience erupted into applause again, but it felt different this time. Warmer somehow. More personal. Margaret looked out at all those faces, some young, some old, some belonging to the people who'd dismissed her just hours ago, and saw something she'd never expected. Respect, the 3 young women who'd been whispering about. Her in the waiting room were on their feet, clapping. The registration lady from the front desk had tears streaming down her face. Even the other judges were standing now, nodding their approval. But it was Maestro Rousseau's words that kept echoing in Margaret's head. A life fully lived, that's what he'd said. Not a perfect life, or a successful life, or a life without regrets. Just a life that had been lived with all its mess and beauty and pain. She thought about Tom, about her children, about all those years of typing and cooking and cleaning. Years she'd sometimes thought of as wasted, as time stolen from the person she was supposed to become. But maybe those years weren't wasted. Maybe they were exactly what had made tonight's performance mean something. Every dish she'd washed, every file she'd typed, every night she'd stayed up with a sick child, all of it had been written into the music she'd just played. Thank you, Margaret whispered to the maestro. Then louder, to the audience, thank you all. She walked off the stage. She tucked the business card carefully into her folder, right next to her photocopied sheet, music with its coffee stains and pencil marks. She was still the same person who'd walked into this building a few hours ago. Same cardigan, same practical shoes, same ordinary life waiting for her outside. But something had shifted. Something small, but important. For the first time in 40 years, Margaret Chen felt seen. Margaret didn't sleep much that night. She kept replaying everything in her mind, the applause. Maestro Rousseau's tears, the way people had looked at her afterward, like she was someone worth knowing. She'd expected to go home the same invisible woman who'd left, but somehow the world had shifted on its axis. The next morning, her phone started ringing. The first call was from her daughter, Amy, who lived 2 states away. Mom, you're not going to believe this. Someone posted a video of your performance online. It has 50,000 views already. Margaret had barely understood what that meant. She didn't use social media much beyond looking at photos of her grandchildren. But Amy walked her through it over the phone. And there it was, a video someone had recorded on their phone from the audience. The quality wasn't perfect, but you could hear every note, see Margaret's tears. Watch Maestro Rousseau stand up at the end. By the afternoon, the video had 500,000 views. By the next morning, it was trending on multiple platforms with millions of people watching. The comments section was filled with strangers from around the world sharing their own stories of abandoned dreams. I stopped painting when I was 20, one person wrote. I'm 45 now. This made me buy canvas and brushes today. I gave up singing to work in my family's store, another comment read. Maybe it's not too late. My dad always wanted to write a book. He died last year without finishing it. This performance made me dig out his manuscript. I'm going to finish it for him. The local news picked up the story first, then the national outlets. Margaret found herself sitting in her small living room, being interviewed by a reporter with perfect makeup and a camera crew that barely fit through her front door. They asked her about the piano in the attic, about Tom, about those 40 years between her childhood lessons and her performance. What would you say to other people who've given up on their dreams? The reporter asked, holding a microphone toward Margaret's face. Margaret thought about it for a moment. I'd say that giving up on a dream doesn't mean it's dead. Sometimes dreams are just sleeping, waiting for the right moment to wake up again. And maybe the waiting, the living, all those years of ordinary life, maybe that's what makes the dream even more beautiful when it finally comes true. The interview aired that evening and was shared thousands of times online. But the most meaningful change happened the following Tuesday when Margaret drove to the conservatory for her first lesson with Maestro. Rousseau, the building was intimidating. All marble columns and walls covered with portraits of famous composers. Students walked the halls carrying violin cases and sheet music, talking about concerts and competitions. Margaret felt out of place in her regular clothes, carrying her worn folder. But she'd made a promise to herself that she wouldn't let fear stop her anymore. Maestro. Rousseau's office was on the third floor. Filled with books and framed photographs of him performing around the world, he greeted her warmly, shaking her hand with both of his. Mrs. Chen, welcome. Please, sit at the piano. For the next hour, he listened to her play different pieces. Asked her about her practice routine, gently corrected her hand position and posture. He was kind but honest, pointing out where her self-teaching had created bad habits while praising the musicality that no amount of technique could manufacture. You have work to do, he told her at the end of the lesson. But you also have something precious that must be protected. As we improve your technique, we must not lose that emotional honesty. That is the rare gift. They agreed to meet every Tuesday. Margaret drove home that day feeling like she'd stepped into someone else's life. A life where impossible things became possible. The months that followed were strange and wonderful. The video of her performance kept spreading, and Margaret received messages from people all over the world. A woman in Japan who'd started learning piano at 60, a man in Brazil who'd picked up his guitar after 20 years, a grandmother in Australia who'd enrolled in art classes after watching Margaret play. You made me believe it wasn't too late, they wrote. Over and over in different languages, the same message. You made me believe. Margaret's own playing improved under Maestro Rousseau's guidance. Her technique became cleaner, her difficult passages smoother. But he always reminded her that technique was just the tool, not the purpose. Anyone can learn to play the notes, he'd say. You must continue to play the truth. 6 months after the recital, Maestro Rousseau asked Margaret if she would consider performing at a benefit concert the conservatory was organizing. The money would go to provide music lessons for children whose families couldn't afford them. Seems fitting, he said with a gentle smile. You understand better than most what it means to lose access to music because of money. Margaret agreed, though the thought of performing again terrified her. This time, she'd be on a much bigger stage, with a much larger audience. An expectation she wasn't sure she could meet, the night of the benefit concert. Margaret's 3 children flew in to watch. They sat in the front row, her 2 sons with their wives, her daughter with her husband, and Margaret's 2 grandchildren. Seeing them there made Margaret's eyes water before she even touched the piano. She wore a dress for this performance, a simple but elegant navy blue one that Amy had helped her pick out. No more cardigans and practical shoes. Though, as she'd told Amy while shopping, I'm still the same person underneath. I know, Mom, Amy had said, squeezing her hand. But that person deserves to feel beautiful too. The concert hall was packed. Margaret recognized some faces from the recital, including the young man who'd dismissed her in the waiting room. He'd sent her an apology letter weeks ago, which she'd appreciated. Growing up meant learning that you'd been wrong, and having the courage to say so. When it was her turn to perform, Margaret walked to the piano with steady steps. She wasn't as nervous this time, though her heart still beat fast. She'd prepared something special for tonight, an original composition she'd been working on with Maestro Rousseau's guidance. She'd titled it The Long Road Home. The piece began softly, almost hesitantly, like someone learning to walk again after an injury. It captured those early days in her attic, fumbling through scales, her fingers not quite remembering what they once knew. The melody was simple, but carried weight, like a question being asked in the darkness. Then it grew. The middle section was fuller, more complex, representing all those years of living, the joy and the sorrow, the ordinary moments and the extraordinary ones, the love and the loss. She'd woven in a melody she used to sing to her children at bedtime, and a phrase that reminded her of Tom humming while he worked in the garden. The final section brought everything together. It wasn't triumphant or showy. Instead, it was peaceful, resolved, like finally arriving at a place you'd been searching for your whole life. The last notes faded away gently, like a door closing on the past while another opened to the future. The applause was immediate and warm. But what mattered most to Margaret wasn't the standing ovation or the praise from critics in the audience. It was the look on her grandchildren's faces, wonder and pride mixed together, and the way her daughter was crying happy tears. After the concert, dozens of people came up to thank her, to share their stories, to tell her what her music meant to them. Among them was a young girl, maybe 11 or 12, who approached shyly with her mother. "Mrs. Chen," the girl said quietly, "I want to learn piano, but we can't afford lessons. My mom works 2 jobs already." Margaret knelt down to the girl's eye level, seeing herself at that age. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Rebecca." "Well, Rebecca, did you know this concert is raising money so kids like you can have music lessons? That's why we're here tonight. So that money never has to be the reason someone stops making music." The girl's eyes went wide. Her mother was crying now, too. Margaret stood and took the girl's hand. "Keep that dream alive, Rebecca. Even if you can't take lessons right away, keep it alive in your heart. Sing, hum, tap out rhythms on the table. Dreams are patient. They'll wait for you." Later that night, back home in her quiet house, Margaret sat at her old attic piano. The Steinway Grands and concert halls were wonderful, but this was where her journey had really begun. This piano, with its sticky keys and out-of-tune strings, had given her back to herself. She played softly, not practicing anything in particular, just letting her fingers wander across the keys. Through the thin walls, she heard her neighbor's television, the sound of a dog barking down the street, all the ordinary sounds of ordinary life, and she smiled, because she'd learned something important in these past months. The magic wasn't in the concert halls, or the applause or the viral videos. The magic was in the choice to try, even when it seemed too late. The magic was in finding the courage to be seen, to be heard, to take up space in the world. Margaret was 52 years old. She'd spent 40 years being invisible, practical, putting everyone else's dreams before her own. But now she knew the truth. It's never too late to play your song. The music doesn't care how old you are or how long you've been silent. It just waits, patient and eternal, for the moment when you're finally ready to let it out. And when you do, when you finally give voice to all that longing and hope and life lived in the margins, that's when the real music begins. That's when you come home.